Well, folks, you hear right there, you hear supporters of Karmelo Anthony, who was somehow convicted, sentenced, and processed in the same day. I've literally never heard of that happening ever since I've been following the news and cases. For context, Karmelo Anthony was involved in the fatal stabbing of 17-year-old Austin Metcalf at a high school track meet in Frisco, Texas, last April. Now, this case drew national attention because of basically Karmelo Anthony claimed that it was self-defense. Now, according to the trial testimony, Anthony, who attended Centennial High School, was sitting under a team tent belonging to Memorial High School during a rain delay. Several students, including Austin Metcalf, told him to leave. Witnesses said the confrontation escalated when Anthony allegedly responded with words to the effect of "touch me and see what happens," while reaching into his backpack. Metcalf then pushed Anthony. Anthony pulled out a knife and stabbed Metcalf once in the chest. Metcalf suffered a wound to the heart and died later. Anthony was arrested at the scene and acknowledged that he stabbed Karmelo. Now, there's been some discrepancies in what happened because at the time, Eddie Parra, who was dating, Karmelo Anthony was dating Eddie Parra's girlfriend, and supposedly Eddie Parra invited Karmelo Anthony to sit under the tent because I guess it was raining or there was some inclement weather or something. Now, at the trial, it seems like Eddie Parra went back on his initial statements, and a few of the students there went back on their initial statements of what they witnessed at the time, which is a little bit strange. So Anthony's attorneys were arguing that he was acting in self-defense. They contended that Metcalf made the first physical contact by pushing him, and that Anthony feared for his safety in what they described as a chaotic, rapidly unfolding confrontation. Now, under the law in Texas, self-defense can be used to justify the use of force if a person reasonably fears imminent harm. And I think it's important to understand that Karmelo Anthony was by himself under the tent, whereas you had Austin Metcalf and his twin brother, and some other players, or apparently their friends or whatever, who were, I guess, ganging up on Anthony. Karmelo Anthony is 5'8" and 130 pounds. The Metcalf brothers are both over 6 feet tall and over 200 pounds. So they are much bigger than he is. Much bigger. Much bigger. And, now, the prosecution argued that Anthony provoked the confrontation and say that a shove did not justify a deadly response. They characterized the stabbing as a murder rather than self-defense and pointed to witness testimony that Anthony warned Metcalf before pulling the knife. Now, since Anthony was 17 at the time, Anthony was 17 at the time, but was tried as an adult under Texas law. And after a highly publicized trial, the jury ultimately rejected the self-defense claim, finding him guilty of murder and sentencing him to 35 years in prison. And he may become eligible for parole after serving a portion of that sentence. Now, see, what's bizarre to me, like virtually a lot of this case has been bizarre to me. First and foremost, you have to say it is absolutely tragic for both families. The Metcalf family to lose their son. Nobody deserves to lose their son in that manner. And for the Anthony family, again, nobody deserves to lose their son in that manner either. And this was a really tragic situation of two young men, adrenaline's pumping, testosterone's out the wazoo, and we live in a very racially polarized, a very culturally polarized moment. And they're in Texas, of all places. Texas is very known for having a very, let's just be real, a racist history and a racist legal system there in Texas and a racist culture in Texas. I can't be in the mind of Karmelo Anthony or Austin Metcalf, but I can just say myself as a black person who was at one point a black boy, to have a bunch of white boys surrounding me who are much bigger than me and threatening me seems like something that would, constitute a certain amount of fear, because that's been the argument. That was basically the argument they were making, that he had a reasonable, there's a reasonable expectation of fear in that situation. You don't know what's going to happen. And obviously, just like everything else in this culture that we live in, there's nothing in this country that doesn't end up being about the culture war. Nothing. You can't do anything without it turning into black and white, liberal versus conservative, Democrat versus Republican. You can't do anything. The fact that Karmelo Anthony's black and Austin Metcalf is white obviously stoked a lot of the fire of this case. Now, the thing I found that was very bizarre about this case, I talked about it a few minutes ago, was that Anthony was convicted, sentenced, and processed the same day. Has anybody ever seen that? I have never seen that. Usually there's a conviction, and then they say, well, we'll be back in 2 weeks to sentence you. And the judge, I guess the judge or whoever deliberates or over the next few weeks, and then they sentence you to whatever time after figuring out an adequate punishment. And then after you get sentenced, you get, put into whatever prison or whatever, get processed then. But in this case, he's been convicted, sentenced, and, already processed. He's already in prison where he's going to be, apparently. That I've never seen anything like that in the world. Now, look, this is the United States of America. Okay, I think Americans really don't understand, and it's not until you start talking to people, whether it's online or whether it's in person or wherever, from other countries, particularly Europe, where they really don't understand our culture, why our culture is so violent, and why so many people jump to the most extreme forms of violence as soon as something happens. But that is who we are in America. And so I think it's really unfortunate, like I said, that Austin Metcalf died the way he did. But I do also think that there has to be a consistent standard of justice. And I don't feel like we're seeing that in this particular case. That is where I'm coming to it from the case. Like I said, anytime you kill somebody, that's technically wrong. It's, thou shalt not kill is in the Bible. But legally, in this country, you're allowed to have a reasonable expectation of self-defense. And in this country, we've seen in other cases, like Kyle Rittenhouse. Kyle Rittenhouse was a 17-year-old white young man who lived in Illinois during the 2020 protest, had his mom take him to Kenosha, Wisconsin with an AR-15 that he wasn't supposed to have. He gets into some confrontations and he shoots and kills 2 people. The jury says, okay, you have a right to, you were threatened and therefore and which he was. I even pushed back against that, and there were a lot of liberal circles who just said he just murdered those 2 people for no reason. They were assaulting him. They were picking on him. And I'm not saying that it's right, but I'm just saying that he didn't just randomly shoot random people for no reason. They got in a confrontation. And he shot people who were in a confrontation with him. He completely gets off scot-free, in spite of being, again, essentially pursuing this situation in a way that Karmelo Anthony did not. Karmelo Anthony did not go a state away, cross state lines with an assault weapon looking to confront people, protesters, at an event that he didn't agree with. Karmelo Anthony was just sitting under a tent because it was raining. And he was confronted by other people. You look at George Zimmerman, the infamous Trayvon Martin case. George Zimmerman was driving in his truck, sees Trayvon Martin, a young black kid in a hoodie with Skittles and iced tea, and says, this kid looks suspicious, and we've had some break-ins recently, so, let me, call the police. George Zimmerman calls the police. The police dispatcher says to George Zimmerman, she says, bro, if the kid's not doing anything, if he's just walking and minding his own business, you just go home and leave the kid alone, because there's really nothing you can do in that situation. George Zimmerman ignores 911. The dispatcher continues to follow Trayvon Martin. Picks a fight with Trayvon Martin, somehow gets out of his truck. Remember, George Zimmerman is in a truck. Trayvon Martin is on foot. This was a confrontation that should have never happened. Like, literally should have never happened. Because if George Zimmerman just stays in his truck and minds his own business, this never happens. So he continues following this kid who's minding his own business. Somehow ends up outside of the truck. They get into a confrontation, and he ends up shooting and killing Trayvon Martin. Again, in the state of Florida, they say he has a reasonable expectation for self-defense. Rick Chow, we just talked about this story last week. Cyrus Carmack Belton was running away from the store and wasn't even stealing. Rick Chow accused him of stealing, but the surveillance video shows that Cyrus Carmack Belton put back the juice that he was holding and put it back. So he wasn't even stealing. And running away from the store, Rick Chow shoots him in the back. He has a reasonable expectation of self-defense. And even young people who've been convicted of crimes and basically been caught committing crimes have not faced the level of punishment that we see in this case. There was a young man named Jesse Mack Butler, a young white teenager who was 16 and 17 when he assaulted two 16-year-old girls. He faced 10 felony counts, including attempted rape, rape by instrumentation, forcible oral sodomy, sexual battery, domestic assault, and battery by strangulation. In that case, the investigators found the video evidence on his phone. They had the evidence of Jesse Mack Butler on his phone, which showed one victim strangled to unconsciousness. He was sentenced to outpatient counseling, community service, rehabilitation, and strict curfew supervision until he turns 19. Until he turns 19, folks. Not even like 25, 30, 35. No, he's got about 2 years, a year or two. He avoided serving any time behind bars whatsoever, and the convictions can be erased from his record when he turns 19. In the same state of Texas, you have Alec Adamson from Prosper, Texas, who shot and killed a black student. He leads the police on a high-speed car chase and a foot pursuit. He gets 4 years in prison and served 2. Now, this is somebody who murdered somebody and led the police on a car chase. Sentenced to 4 years, serves 2 years. Same state, Dallas. Amber Geiger, who is a Dallas police officer, drunkenly stumbles into the wrong apartment in her apartment complex. She stumbles into the apartment of Botham Jean, a young man, young Haitian man, minding his own damn business. And she stumbles into his apartment. He was unarmed. She shoots him. She gets 10 years. 10 years. Breaking into somebody's apartment, shooting somebody because she was drunk. She gets 10 years. You have Jason Van Dyke in Chicago, who murdered Laquan McDonald. That was the tape that Barack Obama's buddy, his former chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, hid from everybody for years. You can see Laquan McDonald walking away from everybody. He is holding a knife, but he's not near anybody. He's completely on the side of a street by himself, walking away from everybody. Jason Van Dyke shoots this man 16 times while he's walking away. He is convicted and sentenced to 6 years and 9 months. He only served 3 years in prison before he was released. You have Sean Lucas, same state, Wolf City, Texas, who murdered Jonathan Price, who was unarmed. He shot him 4 times outside of a Quickie Mart. He was acquitted by an all-white jury. Now, the reason I say that is because Karmelo Anthony, with 35 years, has received more time than Derek Chauvin, who murdered George Floyd, Amber Geiger, Rick Chow, and George Zimmerman put together. You have people who literally murdered unarmed people who were minding their own business, who haven't gotten in the state of Texas, who murdered unarmed, innocent people chilling in their own apartments, who got 1/3 of the time that Karmelo Anthony got for being in a fight, being threatened by multiple football players who are much bigger than him. Again, he's only 130 pounds. They're well over 200 pounds. They've gotten far more time than he got. I mean, he's gotten far more time than they got. And so I think we have to, as the black community, ask, is there any circumstance in which a black person can ever claim self-defense whatsoever? Is self-defense only for white people? Because if you just wanted to say killing somebody because you got into a confrontation is wrong and it's murder, then okay, fine. Be what it will, you know. But if you're going to let all these other people get out of jail or barely sentence them to any time whatsoever, even when they've literally murdered innocent random people, at that point you have to start looking at the racial bias of the situation. And to only make things worse, since the conviction last week, the conviction and sentencing, Jeff Metcalf, Austin Metcalf's father, has come out with extremely racist videos. I'm not going to play them here, but in one of them he calls Karmelo Anthony the watermelon felon, and says black fatigue is real and that we're all sick of black people. If that's how their father talks, imagine what his sons were saying to Karmelo Anthony that day under that tent in Frisco, Texas. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying I'm happy Austin Metcalf is dead. I'm obviously not, regardless of how terrible his father seems to be. But I am going to say that either we have a standard of justice that is equally applicable to everyone in this country, or we don't have justice at all. In the immortal words of James Baldwin, before I get out of here, to be a Negro in this country and relatively conscious is to be in a state of rage almost all of the time. Amen to that, brother. Well, folks, we got to go to a break. You hear the music. When we come back, we're going to get into, I think, is a somewhat of a positive story. The Democrats who are dragging the old Democratic Party kicking and screaming, possibly towards success. We'll be right back here on Straight Outta Cannon with me, Scott Cannon. Please stay with us.